But I do have the great Tony Benn above my shoulder. And when I see the kind of sickening apologism for Israel on the media that we have today, it really makes me miss him even more. You'll remember his heroic um, uh, actions on the BBC in 2009. I want to start kind of where Alex left off a little bit, just starting with slightly with the current context and then moving on from there. I mean, this is now the fifth assault against Gaza in 15 years. It has become an almost routine cycle where Israel provokes the Palestinians, where Hamas responds with some rockets, and then Israel uses that as a pretext to launch a massive offensive that kills hundreds and thousands of civilians. I do think this time there is something different in that which I think changes the situation. I think the scale of Hamas's attack is bigger than anything they've previously done, and the Israeli death toll is higher than 5 years of the Second Intifada combined. But I think situating this in the context that Alex laid out is really important because this comes in the deadliest year for Palestinians in nearly 2 decades, where, as Alex outlined, settlers have become increasingly emboldened in carrying out horrific attacks against the Palestinians, in literally shooting Palestinian children in the head, setting them on fire, occupying people's houses, burning down the village of Hawara, and with full support from the Israeli government, who has carried out raids in refugee camps in Jenin and killed numerous people, attacking Al-Aqsa, and so on. And in the context that Alex laid out of the most right-wing government that Israel has ever seen, which is openly talking about, wiping out Gaza and the rest of it. And Netanyahu, who has been facing a domestic crisis and has been open about using his attacks on Palestinians as a means to stoke up nationalist sentiment to try and get out of that. But I think it also comes at a time of renewed organized resistance by Palestinians who have completely lost faith, a majority have completely lost faith in the Palestinian Authority, who is seen by many Palestinians rightly as Israel having outsourced its occupation to them. And what we saw during the 2021 attack a couple of years ago was the highest level of coordination amongst Palestinians in all parts of Palestine and in the refugee camps outside of Palestine. We saw Palestinians who live within Israel, who have Israeli citizenships, mobilizing in huge numbers, not seen since the first Intifada. We saw a general strike. We've seen new networks of Palestinians organizing in Nablus and Jenin to stop settler attacks and stop Israeli military attacks. We saw Palestinians in Jordan actually break through the Israeli border fence into the West Bank in 2021. And I think this is context which I think points to why the situation right now is a change in the status quo. And we see that in Israel's response. We see the level of the barbaric siege which they have now placed Gaza under, the massive bombardment that they're carrying out. Uh, Sorry, I lost my words. Yeah, but I think it's also the context for why there is no equivalence between Hamas's attack and the daily escalating terrorism inflicted by Israel on Palestinians. When I visited in 2019, my one conclusion from what I saw was that, and this was in the West Bank, was that this was not sustainable. The daily oppression and subjugation of the Palestinian people was not a way that anyone could endure living their entire lives. Um, and and so I think of course, any loss of civilian life is tragic, but I think that's precisely our point, which is that civilians are always the casualties of war, and that it has to stop, and that the Palestinians who are killed and occupied and ethnically cleansed constantly matter just as much, and that peace can only be achieved from the freedom of Palestine. And the hypocrisy has been ranked since January, when Israel has killed over 200 Palestinians, and all the other crimes they've committed. Has the BBC ever called in the Israeli ambassador and asked him to condemn the Israeli government? Not once. And the line at the moment being used by Keir Starmer and others who are trying to justify Israel's punishment of the Palestinians, that what Hamas has done is actually pushed back the prospect of peace, is simply a lie, because peace has never been on the table for the Palestinian people. Um, the Oslo Accords, which was probably the most significant attempt, if you want to call it that, at a two-state solution for for Palestine and Israel, was in fact actually used to entrench Israel's occupation of the West Bank further, to completely isolate Gaza, and to carry on this status quo of pretending to negotiate for peace while maintaining the occupation of Palestinians. We've seen the Palestinians have tried to resist in every way possible. In 2018 and 2019, when Gazans were marching up to the border fence peacefully, they were targeted by Israeli snipers. 30,000 of them were shot. Razan al-Najjar, a medic, was shot in the head. Um, when they called for the international community to boycott, divest from companies who are directly complicit in the occupation, we have seen, states in the United States pass legislation that outlaws that. We've seen the Tories currently try to pass legislation to outlaw that, and any attempt to talk about BDS is being labeled as anti-Semitic. And I think we have to recognize that the only reason there is a Palestinian cause is because the Palestinians are resisting. And I think that means that as socialists, our starting point has to be um, to defend their right to resist, to defend Palestinian life, and to make clear that every drop of blood spilled is the responsibility of the Israeli regime and their Western backers. And I think this brings me to what we can think of in terms of a solution. And I think the starting point for that has to be in locating Israel as uh, an outpost of Western imperialism. I don't want to go too much into the kind of debate around the two-state solution and a one-state solution, because as Alex said, the two-state solution is dead. If it ever existed, it was used to pacify the Palestinian struggle. And in any case, with the settlements all over the West Bank, with what we're seeing in Gaza, with the absolute refusal of any rights of the Palestinian refugees, the two-state solution simply is not a feasible outcome, and is not just anywhere. So I think what we have to be fighting for is a single democratic state, like what existed before the imposition of the Zionist project. And I think in terms of how that's possible, I think we have to start from understanding Israel's role within the Western imperialist project, because Israel was founded, was created in order to maintain the Western imperialist interests. It has become the watchdog state, which has been used to maintain Western hegemony of the Middle East. And again, I don't want to go into massive detail, but I wrote an article earlier this year as part of our Nakba 75 series, which I'll post in the chat and I think is worth a read. But just to give one example of how Israel carries out the West's actions for it, we saw in 2006 when the United States was fighting its war in Afghanistan and Iraq and facing resistance and was embroiled in those wars, and Hezbollah was growing as a regional power. They relied on Israel to attack Hezbollah and to try and pacify its power in the Middle East. Um, of course, they lost that war, and that was a massive blow to Western imperialism. And I think everything that Israel has done since has been an attempt to try and, show its usefulness to Western imperialism in maintaining its control of the Middle East. And I think a large part of why it carries out these horrific bombardments of Gaza is about reminding the people of the Middle East who has the power, who has that military power, where it's coming from. And we've seen just in the last couple of days since Israel has begun its bombing of Gaza, the United States has authorized immediate emergency military aid to Israel. It has moved one of its warships into the sea near Israel. And I think what we've seen since 2011, particularly since the Arab Spring, since there was a challenge to the local powers who serve the interests of the West, that those countries as well have relied even more on Israel and its role in helping them to maintain that status quo, that domination of the Arab people in the Middle East. And I think what this leads us is to two conclusions. The first is that Palestinian liberation is inherently tied in with the wider liberation of the Middle East. It is inherently tied in to the defeat of the imperialist project. And I think that points us in the direction of the Arab peoples themselves, of the Arab working classes across the Middle East. And there is that famous quote of the Palestinian revolutionary George Habash, which says, "The road to Jerusalem is through Cairo, Damascus, and Amman." And we saw during the Arab Spring, when there were popular revolts for democracy in some of these countries, that in all of those mass protests, the Palestinian flag was dominant. The Palestinian cause has always been central to the freedom, the aspirations for freedom of all Arab peoples. Um, and any hope, I think, that the West had, that the crushing of the Arab Spring has diminished that the normalization process that they've tried to begin with Arab countries has diminished that, was shot out last year during the Football World Cup. I don't watch football, but I did see the viral TikToks of Arabs in Qatar being interviewed by Western journalists and saying "Free Palestine" every opportunity they got, waving the Palestinian flag, refusing to be interviewed by Israeli media channels, and so on. And I think particularly at the moment where the West has been inching towards this deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the current situation has stopped that, I think. And on, I think it was Sunday, the the number one trend in the Middle East on Twitter was Saudis with Palestine. And it was Saudi Arabian people opposing normalization with Israel. So I think we need to recognize that, and I think we need to understand the role of the wider Middle East situation, Middle East, and the role of the Arab working classes in opposing Western imperialism at large in order to bring about Palestinian liberation. And I think the second conclusion is what it points towards us here as socialists living in the imperial core, in the countries that are perpetrating this. And that is that we have to do everything to weaken British imperialism. British imperialism, which is central to the functioning of the British state. Um, Everything we can do to weaken the British state is a step towards Palestinian liberation. And I think that means directly through building the Palestine solidarity movement and challenging our government's uncritical support for Israel and making that argument about why they're doing that and where their interests lie. But it also means more generally, I think every strike from every worker in every sector that breaks the power of the British state is a step towards minimizing British imperialism and their role in the oppression of the Palestinian people. But within the Palestine solidarity movement, which is absolutely essential in and of itself, I think we have a real challenge on our hands because although we have at the moment the biggest Palestine solidarity movement outside of the Middle East, and rightly so, given our country's role in what's going on, we have faced a series of challenges in recent years, and namely the anti-Semitism smears, which at the time we were arguing, had to be rebutted robustly, not only to save the Corbyn project at the time, but because of the damage they would do to the movement more broadly. And we're seeing the results of that now. That failure to rebut those attacks is what is being used against us now. It is why the Labour left is completely silent in terms of the MPs, have been completely silent on this question. Afsana Begum was hounded out of Labour conference simply for taking a picture with the PSC stall. John McDonnell, in his interview, talking about what's going on, had to repeat it, felt that he repeatedly had to say that I understand Israel's anger, but they need to show restraint. That was his line. That is not the line of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Our line is to defend the lives of the Palestinians who are being killed right now. And I think we have built this movement over the last 20 years as a central part of the anti-war movement. And it has been on that basis of linking up socialists, revolutionaries, those in the Labour Party. And I think we have a challenge on our hands given this kind of section of the movement has vacated the field. And the other challenge we're facing is an increasingly authoritarian picture from the government. I mean, I've always, as long as I've been a Palestine solidarity activist, and I'm sorry, I know I've gone over time, I'm summing up. As long as I've been a Palestine solidarity activist, our government has been vociferous in its support for Israel. But I've never seen the level of rhetoric coming out of the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, the threats to ban the waving of the Palestinian flag, to ban any chant saying Palestine should be free, to link any kind of support for Palestinian freedom with support for Hamas. And I think that is a challenge that we're going to have to face. And, I want to see the police try and arrest 70,000, 100,000 people on Saturday with Palestinian flags. But that is the kind of mobilization and organization that we will need to make sure that they can't do that. And so just to end, I'll say that, what I've just said about the Palestine solidarity movement, I think is extremely important. I think the question of its role within the wider anti-war movement and challenging British imperialism at large and Western imperialism at large is extremely important. And on that, I think the role of socialists within this movement is extremely important because had it not been for the left fighting for that unity back in 2001, between the Labour left and between the radical left, between the Muslim community and the left, we wouldn't have had the anti-war movement that we did. We wouldn't have had the Palestine solidarity movement that we did. And that is something that we need to keep, that unity we need to keep fighting for and rebuilding constantly. And I think socialists are central to that. And I also think that what we've discussed tonight, I think locating Israel's position within the Western imperialist project as a central part of understanding how Palestine can be free is extremely important. And that is something that socialists have to do. And that is an argument that we have to put to the movement and win in the movement. So I'll end just by saying I urge everyone to be on the demonstration on Saturday. It's 12 p.m. outside the BBC on Portland Place. And also to get involved in a socialist organization. If you're not in Counterfire, I would suggest you join. Thanks.